So today's review is going to be of the Audeze Sine, a planar magnetic on-ear closed back headphone coming in at I think the retail is $500 US. However, I think that's sharply dropped due to the fact that this is no longer in production. It has been phased out almost, and I think they're planning to replace this with the Audeze LCD1 closed. Talking about build, this is probably one of the best built headphones I've felt. Starting from the headband, you've got really nice premium leather here, stitched, and you have metal hinges here. I believe they're aluminium, otherwise it would be a little bit heavier. The swivel is really smooth, really linear, really nice. Clamp is great too, very linear. I'm sure you can stretch it out if you find it too tight. You've got pretty much no signs of plastic anywhere on the outside. So extended mechanisms have really great resistance, very tight, but at the same time you never feel like you're going to break the headphone. You just feel that it's a very premium mechanism that will stay in place wherever you stop the mechanism. On that, the hinges get plenty of swivel. Really nice cups here. There is leather on the outside, and again the metal comes all the way around, all the way down there, and around. Got your name there, Audeze logo there, and the cables themselves are a strange cable. They're flat cables, which I actually don't really like, because when they rub against things they seem to create some sound, and they are a little bit stiff and a little bit janky, which I don't like. And the connectors are very bizarre, because they are 3.5 millimeters. However, they are at a very severe angle. I think that's a 45-degree angle, and that makes aftermarket cables virtually impossible to find. So if your cable breaks, you've got to order one from Audeze, or it's not much use. This, however, is a cipher cable, and this is an OTG cable, and has a DSP built in, as well as an EQ which you can set. It also functions as DAC amp, so you can definitely run this off this cable instead of a desktop setup. Power requirements for this headphone, I'd say they are surprisingly difficult to power for a portable headphone. For a portable headphone, you think of something that you can drive from your phone, but I think that the phone doesn't really power these enough, and I actually had to turn these up more than some of my open back headphones, such as the Focal Clear. So this, I wouldn't say by any means is a insanely hard to power headphone, but it does require a bit of power. So you might want to invest in at least a simple player, or something like the cipher cable, which fixes the sound a little bit. So definitely something that's worth looking into. Other than that, it comes with a bag that's magnetized at the top. However, I don't think it's going to offer your headphone much protection from impact. It's more just to prevent things from scratching up. Comes with a standard 3.5mm to 6.5mm adapter. Other than that, that's most of what you get with this headphone. So reasonable amount of accessories, particularly if you buy it with a cipher cable. So how does this headphone stack up? First of all, we have to understand that an on-ear closed-back planar magnetic headphone is probably one of the smallest markets in any headphone type. On-ears simply are not popular among audiophiles, and for good reason. There's less surface area for driver, there's less space between your ear and the driver, and so a lot of the time on-ears tend to sound congested and very narrow. And this is no exception. And on-ears, due to their small size, often tend to have very tight constrictions when it comes to things like resonances and technical ability. However, I think that the Sine is one of the few headphones that rises above the limitations of its design to deliver something that is quite competitive sounding. Starting off with the bass. The bass on Audeze Sine is very linear. I was very surprised by this, because on-ears tend to have very bloated bass, but the Audeze Sine sounded very tight, very linear, very fast. I think there might have been a bit of mid-bass emphasis, but it was so minor that I think it was to its benefit. Something like this, when you bring on the go, a little bit of extra bass often helps a lot. How does it compare to other headphones in terms of bass? I think this is probably some of the best bass you can get for the price in a closed back, regardless of whether it's on ear or over ear. And that should say a lot about how good the bass on this is. And I think that's largely due to the planar magnetic driver, which allows a very linear response, and Audeze planars tend to slam very hard, which this is no exception. And I have opened the back, and there is a huge amount of dampening behind the back, behind the driver itself. And I think that is very important to get the bass to sound as natural as it does on this, because a lot of on-ear headphones have really bad resonances in the bass, and the amount of dampening behind this driver is probably the most I've seen in any headphone, and that really helps with eliminating a lot of the resonances which I hear in other on-ears. So moving on to the mid-range. The mid-range, again, continues that characteristic of being very neutral, very linear. And I think that the mid-range on this is really, really flat. Low mids and the middle of the mid-range is quite even and quite well balanced. However, I will say that this shares a little bit of that characteristic of a upper mid-range recession. However, it's nowhere as severe as something like the LCD4 or the LCD-X or the LCD3. This is probably one of the least offensive Audezes in that regard. So you're not going to have problems of this sounding muffled when it comes to female vocals. So moving on to treble now. The treble is one area of this headphone where I would change a little bit. The treble on this is a little bit sharp. Not in the areas that traditionally hurt you, such as the 6K region or the 9K region. So a lot of sibilance doesn't really come through with a lot of bite. Which is good, because sibilance in a headphone is probably one of the biggest killers for me in terms of sound. One way which this is rectified is through this cable right here. This is Audeze's cipher cable. As you can see, there is a iPhone plug here, and this remote looking thing right here is a huge DAC amp. And this DAC amp has DSP built in, which EQs up the bass a little bit to match a Harman target more, as well as eliminate a bit of that sharpness in the treble. And the sharpness in the treble, I think, is mainly focused past 10K, which is a good thing, because that means this has a lot of air, surprisingly so. Very well extended. However, I think that in some cases it's a little excessive, and if you are young and have good hearing, it could come across as a little bit artificial, a little bit shiny. And I think that if you want a more natural listen, I would drop that area above 10K down a little bit. However, if you have trouble hearing above 10K, this characteristic might be helpful, because it will help bump up those frequencies that might seem muffled in comparison in a regular frequency response. Overall, very, very nicely tuned closeback. Closebacks tend to have a tendency to have very bizarre tunings, and this is one of the few exceptions to that. It matches what I prefer very closely and is a surprisingly balanced listen. The soundstage on this headphone is probably the weakest part though. The soundstage is very, very narrow. I want to say there's no soundstage, but it is very, very limited. Height is decent, but again, limited as well. It's not a very big sounding headphone and doesn't try to be. And I think that's partly to do with how close the drivers are to your ear. If you look at the pads, there is not much distance between your ear and the driver. And also, the back of the driver has heaps of dampening, and the dampening really cuts down the soundstage. But I think that's a worthy trade-off, because without that, I think it would have really bizarre resonances and have a much more bizarre frequency response. Other than that, this is a really dynamic headphone. Slam on this headphone is really great, and I think much better than most on-ears and better than a lot of over-ear closebacks at the same price. The planar drivers in here slam really hard, and dynamics is great. So how does it compare? I think that if you're using this with the regular cable, it is probably very competitive with other headphones, other closebacks in that price range. So I'm thinking about things like the MDR Z7, the Shure 1540s, and maybe the Foss X00. So against the Sony Z7s, I think these are definitely better. These have tighter bass, they're faster sounding, they're more detailed, just more lively listen. The Z7s in comparison sound bloated, sound slow, and not very detailed. However, I will say that the Z7s sound much wider than these, and so if you're after a very relaxing, very bassy, laid back sound, maybe that's a way to go. Compared to the Shure 1540s. The Shure 1540s are much more bassy. I would say that this sounds brighter than the Shure 1540s. The Shure 1540s sound pretty neutral, but the bass is less dynamic, doesn't slam nearly as hard, but has more in terms of quantity, so they kind of even out there. The 1540s, I think, has a much more natural sounding mid-range and treble, which is to its benefit. However, I will say the Sine does sound ever so slightly more detailed in the bass and treble. Now the mid-range on the 1540s sound pretty detailed, I think a little bit more than the Sines. Finally, compared to the X00s, the X00s are a bit of an unfair comparison because that headphone is almost semi-open, where this is pretty much completely closed. Compared to that headphone, I think this headphone sounds slightly similar, where they both have elevated treble. However, I think the elevated treble on the Sine is more tastefully done because it is not focused in areas where sibilance traditionally comes through. However, the bass, I will say, is more fun on X00s. They're both very tight, very fast, very detailed, but the X00s has a really fun, punchy characteristic to it and has that natural dynamic driver decay, whereas this has a planar driver, which is linear and accurate, but maybe not as fun. Mid-range, I will say, is better on these because the mid-range I find way too recessed on the X00s. So compared to the market, I think this is a really good offering. It competes even with some open backs and most of the closed backs, even over-ear ones. So if you're looking at something which has a portable high-end sound in a small package, this is the way to go.